Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's lovely that we've got such a small group. I'm hoping we can have some really good conversation. My name is Pavel Senkel. I'm the head of Schumacher College and the director of learning here at Dartington. And I want to welcome you all to tonight's Earth Talk with Mitchell Tomashow. Thank you all so much really for joining us and for supporting the work of Schumacher College and of Dartington Trust. So we've been having Earth Talks for many, many years, face-to-face, whether in the old postern or in the Great Hall at Dartington, and they're really a fundamental part of our learning community. Hopefully some of you have been able to take part. We're really looking forward to doing that face-to-face again as soon as we can in the coming weeks and months. And in the meantime, we're really excited that we've been able to continue these, to offer these talks online as we have for the past year. So Schumacher College and Dartington both have a really long history of leadership, debate, and research around our ecological and social challenges. And so it feels doubly important that in this moment of continuing global crisis that we reach out to our community to rekindle relationships and build new partnerships that speak to these concerns at the heart of our mission. And tonight's talk by Mitch Tomashow is, I think, an invitation to reimagine ways of thinking in those contexts of learning, reimagine ways of learning, ways of knowing, and ways of sharing in an environmental context. So Mitch describes himself as an interpretive synthesist. Practice that, interpretive synthesist, a term I really love as it speaks to the important work of sharing and cultivating conversations, experiences, and ideas that are truly multidimensional and far-reaching. So I met Mitch more than a dozen years ago, not 100, a dozen years ago, while he was president of Unity College in Maine in the northeastern US, a position he took the same year that I started as dean at Sterling College in Vermont, only one state away. And I feel like over the years, Mitch and I have shared a path together through a landscape of innovative and leading edge experiential learning. So it seems totally appropriate that we come together now, again, here at Dartington, itself a long storied location for experiments in progressive learning. So Mitch is the author of several books, including Ecological Identity, Becoming a Reflective Environmentalist, Bringing the Biosphere Home, Learning to Perceive Global and Environmental Change, 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus. And tonight, Mitch will share with us, I hope, insights and provocations from his most recent book from MIT Press, To Know the World, A New Vision for Environmental Learning. And this book is such a great blend of critical engagement, resources, personal narrative, and reflection. It not only inspires, but also provides the framework and tools to help us act on that inspiration. I'm really looking forward to the talk and the conversation. But before I hand it over to Mitch, I want to say a couple of words about the format of tonight's talk. And so first, we want the session to be as accessible and interactive as possible. So first, please do introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat so we can get a sense of our audience. And please, during the talk, use the chat button on the bottom of your screen, share thoughts with us and your fellow audience members, and we'd welcome questions throughout using the Q&A link, again, at the bottom of the window. So Mitch might respond to some of these questions as we go along, and I'll have a chance to ask some of the others at the end of the conversation. So in total, we anticipate the session to last about an hour. So thanks again, everyone. And it's with great pleasure that I hand it over to Mitch Tomashow.
Thank you, Pavel. Let me get the screen sharing launched. There we go. There, okay. Well, thank you for the personal introduction. I'm really excited to be here with you, and I hope someday I can join you in person. I've been following Schumacher College and Dartington Trust for most of my career, which is a long time now, and always been excited and impressed at what you're doing, feeling you've always been on the cutting edge of learning, trying out new things when other institutions don't. And I'm really pleased that you're the director there now and have high hopes for what you'll be able to accomplish in the years to come. So it's great. It's my honor and pleasure to be here and to really join a long tradition of very interesting educators and creative thinkers. I think many of your programs are in fact models for interpretive synthesis. So anyway, thank you. And for those of you who've come, thank you so much for taking time. I've looked at some of the names. And there are, of course, many people I don't know, but some some good old friends as well, from all over, really. A friend of mine in New Zealand is here, and a friend in Australia, and a friend in the States, and others as well. So thank you for taking some of your time. And, you know, we all are on the screen so much these days that sometimes I think the last thing we want to do is spend another hour on the screen. So I hope this time is worthwhile for you. I've been in this field a very long time. I'm 71 years old now, and I've been thinking about environmental studies really ever since I could think. I wouldn't have called it when I was 5 years old, of course, but there are many people in my generation who essentially built the field. And there was, when I went to college at New York University in the late 1960s, there was no environmental studies anywhere. There were some ecology programs and some forestry schools, but the idea of interdisciplinary environmental studies just didn't exist. And over several generations, many of us began to build programs, which were the programs we always would have liked to have had. So much of my career has been involved in building those programs in various capacities, as learner, as teacher, as dean, as president, as university president. But now I feel the field has reached a kind of plateau, and it needs to change very dramatically. There are many new directions that environmental studies must pursue if it's going to remain pertinent and creative and important, and for higher ed if it's going to attract the students it deserves. So I want to tell you a little bit about what those directions are and why I feel so strongly about it. And that's going to be the point of this talk. Now, I'm going to go over a lot of material very quickly. That's the way I operate. I hope it inspires you to read some of the books I refer to, or even better, read this book or some of my other ones. But the idea is to just open up all these potential avenues of learning and perception and creativity, so you can choose which ones to follow and where your voice lies within the context of this material. The whole point of this book is to open your voice up and open up your narrative. So when I tell stories about my own life, and when I make things personal in the book, it's because I want you to do the same thing. And that's my philosophy of education. And I want to start at the beginning, if you will, and tell you a little bit about my other work and why I wrote it, and how this book is in many respects a continuation of that. Way back in the early 90s, I wrote my first book, Ecological Identity. I was fascinated by all the people I was working with who chose environmental studies as a field. And I was curious as to why they chose this field and how it changed the way they thought about spirituality, about education, about politics, and of course about the natural world. So this book really covers a lot of that. And it covers a lot of the conversations I would have with students in the classroom, and a lot of the activities that we would collaboratively develop together. And so that book is now still in print, by the way, and it's almost 30 years old already, which is a staggering thought for me. In 2001, I wrote Bring the Biosphere Home, because I had become awakened to the extraordinary challenge of climate change and biodiversity. And I was very interested in thinking about why these concepts are so difficult to perceive. So the whole point of this book is that intimate awareness of local natural history is what opens your ability to see deeper in space and time, and to understand some of these global issues. I also spend a lot of time in this book moving back and forth between ecological and existential questions, because I think at the heart of all environmental studies are existential questions related to meaning and purpose. And that will be clear in the forthcoming book, in my current book as well. The next project, The 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus, reflects my time at Unity College as university president and some of the work I did as a consultant years afterward. And I try to make a case in this book that if you want to become a sustainable campus, you need everyone to be involved. And I go into some depth at some of the strategic approaches, the organizational approaches, the governance approaches, the financial approaches. And of course, I never stray far from my own base, my own foundation, which is place-based natural history. So that's all there. And that's, for the most part, that's an overview of my work. And in many respects, To Know the World is a culminating work for me. And I think it takes the material in Bringing the Biosphere Home, if you may be familiar with that. to its next step 20 years later. So I'm going to go through this book from beginning to end in a pretty linear fashion, so you know what's in it. I'm mostly going to focus on the chapters 3 through 9, with special emphasis on 5 and 6, constructive connectivity and migration. And I'll explain why when I get there. And the second chapter, Memory Forever Unfolding, I'm going to talk about at the very end of the presentation. But one more point of history. When I was 19 years old, way back, well, 18, way back in 1968, I was going to university at New York University in the Bronx in New York City, which is where it was located at the time. In 1968, for me, was an incredible time. First, I was away from home for the first time, but there's the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the environmental movement and the anti-war movement and the music that was coming, well, from the UK, the Beatles and the Stones, and from Motown and from the West Coast of the United States, and the new jazz. It was just a time of incredible creativity. And we honestly thought that we were going to change the world. And I think in large measure for the last 50 years, there have been a lot of people, I won't say who, it's pretty obvious, who've been trying to continually shut that down, but it won't be shut down. And I'll explain why later. One day, I would always, every Friday after class, I would take the subway and we would go to the first car of the subway, because as you went underground, you'd get a light show of sorts. And I'd go to the 8th Street bookstore in downtown Manhattan to see all the new books. Of course, there was no internet, and I was very engaged and curious and intellectually interested. So there were always new books that I wanted to read or new interesting magazines. But one day I saw this book, The Whole Earth Catalog. And to use the parlance of the time, I thought to myself, like, wow. And I took it down off the shelf, brought it back with me to my apartment, and just, spent the entire weekend looking through it. And in retrospect, I think a lot of the work that we've all done, I'm sure this is true for Schumacher College, has been to recreate a lot of the visions that were in the Whole Earth Catalog and make them real for educational purposes. So I wanted to highlight that because I think a lot of the origins of the environmental movement and the sustainability movement, at least intellectually, at least educationally, have a very important foundation in the Whole Earth Catalog, and many interesting books, by the way, and magazines that were to follow, which I won't get into now. Whenever I give a talk in any setting or any context, I always love to show this beautiful photo of this amazing planet that looks almost like a marble I might have had as a child. Just the blues and the greens. And so we can just take a moment and take a breath and once again appreciate what a beautiful place this is. And I'm sorry for my North American centricity here, especially since this is a college in England, the UK, but you'll have to bear with me for all of that. And I also like to remind people that, in my view, learning how to perceive global environmental change is really the crucial educational challenge of our time. So when I was president of the university and I would talk about sustainability, the question is, well, why do we do sustainability? This is the reason why we do it. Why do we write these books? Why do we have these educational programs? Why do we live? And the focus really is because we need to reverse what is in effect a planetary emergency. You know all of this, but it never hurts to briefly remind you without being a bummer about it. Here are the issues in brief. We are now in the early stages of the 6th mega extinction. There have been 5 mega extinctions during the history of life on Earth. A mega extinction is when some percentage, typically greater than 60 of all the Earth species perish. Previous mega extinctions have been caused by a variety of factors, ranging from continental drift to meteor strikes to microbial changes. This 6th one is anthropogenic, it is human caused. So we have an extraordinary responsibility to do whatever we can to reverse this and mitigate it. Of course, this is accompanied with plunging declines in biodiversity and what I like to describe as rapidly changing atmospheric and oceanic circulations. If you look at these beautiful marbles of the planet Earth, it's a circulatory system, and the oceans are part, and the atmosphere are part, and of course bios are all part of this intricate circulatory system of which we know still very little. But we do know that there are imbalances that are taking place that are ecological, that are atmospheric, that are oceanic, that are biogeochemical, and they're all connected. So on the one hand, it's a really incredible time to be alive. And for those of you in a younger generation, this is your challenge. And it's fascinating to see what will happen because environmental change is happening very rapidly. It's also a very dangerous time to be alive. So we have to balance that excitement and those possibilities for change with the dangers that lie in front of us. And I will say more about that in a moment too. I feel strongly that it's time for a new generation of leadership in environmental studies and in higher ed. And I want to explain why that is before I get into the body of the rest of the book. Environmental concerns are connected to all these pertinent issues: economic opportunity, social justice, healthcare, racism, violent conflict, global poverty. But the connections between these issues and the ecological fate of the planet are not easily perceived. So the first question I want to raise for you is, what is the role of environmental studies in making those connections more clear? And this, of course, is a perfect question for anyone who's in higher ed, and certainly for the folks at Schumacher College. I like to think about the tides of change. And by the way, to me, these conditions, which I'm going to go over in a moment, and I'm going to read them because there's a lot to take in, are amplifications of what we first began to notice in the late 60s. They've been with us really since the onset of European expansion and Western imperialism and colonization, but they're really right in our face now. And these are the conditions. Condition one, the rapacious exploitation of the biosphere. How do we best communicate the necessity of ecosystem thinking? Historically, that's what most environmental studies programs and most environmental education has been about. Second is the increasing disparity between rich and poor. How do we promote economic equity and social justice in cultures of materialism and entitlement? That issue has become huge in the last decade as this disparity has become increasingly egregious. And of course, as the most recent American administration made clear its position on that. And condition three, the apprehension concerning the integration and separation of global cultures. How do we promote intercultural understanding and cosmopolitan thinking in the midst of nationalist responses and ethnic chauvinism? Every country in the world is dealing with this question now. We have this extraordinary challenge, which I will get into later when I talk about migration, of the mixing of cultures, and yet this reactionary response, which is to build walls and keep people out. And then finally, condition four, which has been especially challenging in the States: violence, weapons, and terror compete with deliberation, diplomacy, and collaboration. How do we settle our differences through community democracy, compromise, and service in the conflict, behavior, and fear? Interestingly, a decade ago, not many people in the States would have thought this was an important question, and now it has risen to the top of the agenda. But my point to you is that all four of these conditions are related together. You can't deal with one without the other. For many years, environmental studies, professional environmental studies, academic environmental studies would say, well, we just need to study the ecosystem and think about solutions. The other things don't really concern us. And for many years, of course, people who were interested in these other challenges didn't understand necessarily how important the environmental concerns are. Well, now we all know this. Anyone under 30 knows this. Anyone from a community of color knows this. People understand that you have to deal with all of these issues simultaneously. And any higher ed program, any environmental studies program must make this clear as part of their catalog of ideas, courses, and teaching. And again, I suggest that if you look at the climate change movement and you look at climate activism, social justice activism more broadly, then most people understand these relationships. There are important trends that also impact the future of environmental learning. We are living in an urban planet, and by 2050, 80% of the world's population will be living in cities. So solutions have to emphasize urban ecology, which again, I'll say more about later. We live in cosmopolitan cultures. It doesn't matter how much denial we create around this or how much exclusion we create. The fact of the matter is we know that the most innovative cultures are the most cosmopolitan. The most reactionary and conservative and the least creative are those that deny the cosmopolitan quality of the human condition. Ecological equity and social justice are extraordinarily important, as I mentioned before. And the fourth point is that the new information networks and new cognitive orientations that are brought upon us by Zoom, by the internet, and again, I'll say more about this in a moment, are changing the way we see the world very dramatically, and we don't often notice it or understand it. So we need to be much more aware and reflective about how this happens. And that's actually what I'll cover very shortly. And at the same time, we're now in a stage where we have to manage openness and vigilance. And what I mean by that is, especially in these times, it's crucial to make space in your consciousness for diverse points of view, and to listen well to what others have to say, even if you don't agree with them. Yet at the same time, you have to be vigilant, because there are a lot of people out there who don't care about what you have to say and will not listen to you, and can be very violent about opposing who you are and what you believe in. So this is a balance, and it's an important one for us to discuss more publicly than we often do. So these are all issues that I think need to be issues for public discussion, if they're not. So the fourth chapter we've actually covered for 1 and 3 already, in brief, of course, is I asked the question, which also again betrays my 60s background: is the Anthropocene blowing your mind? The Anthropocene is a term that's been thrown around quite a bit, and I don't want to get into it in too much depth, but basically the suggestion is that human impact on the planet has reached the stage that it now is the equivalent of a geological era. And the concept Anthropocene was in fact suggested by geologists. Now, there's a lot of hubris involved in even making a claim like that, and I'm not going to get into whether this is a new geological era or not, but the fact of the matter is Anthropocene is really a short term for the extraordinary resource exploitation, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. Here's what I'm going to go back to the previous slide. I think the Anthropocene is 2 mutually conducive trends. One, the global extraction of natural resources and the intensity of electronic connectivity. If you look at the colonial settlement of North America, United States and/or Canada, it's a history essentially of global resource extraction and the deracination of indigenous peoples. That is the reality of the situation. And this is taking place over a 400 or 500 year period of time. And it's reached its pinnacle really in the last several decades with cheap oil and much cheaper energy. But the other trend is the intensity of electronic connectivity. These things work hand in hand because the result of this intensity of electronic connectivity is a dynamic perceptual reconditioning of human perceptual awareness. It does matter that people, if you walk the streets of the city, or for that matter, any town, there are lots of people who are just looking down at their phone, because that is changing things in a lot of different ways. And again, I'm going to say a little bit more about this later. I keep on saying this, but I really am. And so the question I have for all of us and for educators is, how do we reclaim autonomy in a time of global transformation? How do you get control over your own life? And I think even a lot of the right-wing reaction, knee-jerk reaction to these changes is really, this is the source of some of it. Not all of it, but some of it. It's the feeling that people no longer have autonomy. So what does autonomy mean in this time, in the Anthropocene? And perhaps we know it's a time of suffering, but perhaps it's also a time of awakening. Okay, now I want to shift gears for a moment and make it a little bit more personal and get into this whole question of perceptual reconditioning. On the bottom left, you're looking at where I'm sitting right now. It's from a different angle, but this is my wife calls it the tree house because it's on the 2nd floor of our home. I can look out into the woods. I'm looking out into the woods right now. Spring is very slow to come here, by the way. It's May, what is it, 4th or 5th in rural New Hampshire, and the trees are not fully leafed out. It really is a long time coming, but it's very exciting as well. And it was on some day in March. I was sitting in my room on the bottom left, and I was looking at my computer screen on the upper left. And I was surfing in the internet, as I often do in the morning. I enjoy it. And I realized that my perception was just myopic. I was so focused. There was a tunnel vision to what it was I was doing. And of course, that's true anytime you're on the internet. And you think you're exercising autonomy when you go from one place to another, but really there are lots of algorithms that are directing you from one place to another. It takes a great deal of autonomy and reflection to say, well, Am I going where I want to go? Should I even be on the computer right now? So I took a break and I looked around my room, bottom left again, and I thought about the concept of portals. That on the computer screen on the upper left, every one of those folders is a portal of sorts. And then on the bottom left, every one of those bookshelves, which by the way are intensely curated, is a portal of sorts. Every one of those books is a portal. Every photograph is a portal. And then I looked out the window at another portal, and finally I went outside and I entered the vastness of the portal of the biosphere. And the trip from one of those folders or one of those icons to the vastness of the biosphere is actually quite an interesting journey. But we so often take it for granted and forget about making that journey. So one of the things I do in this chapter is I provide some suggestions about ways of making that journey seamlessly and making sure that you experience the vastness of the biosphere at many times throughout your life. And because really, we are the biosphere reflecting back on itself. By the way, a lot of the artwork, well, all of the artwork on this in this presentation is done by my son, whose art name is Jake Seven. You can look him up, and he does graffiti art in mural art in Hobart, Australia. And so it's an interesting kind of what I would describe as shamanic environmental art. So this is one of his works in situ on a beach not far from the city of Hobart. And this is another one that's deep in the woods someplace, but it's another one of these ideas of bios looking back upon itself, a kind of reflective awareness, asking, well, what have we wrought? So what I suggest is the deliberate pause. And there are many examples throughout this chapter of ways of doing it. How do you take time? It's a form of mindfulness meditation, really. But the object is the natural world. The object is the biosphere. And how do we balance the visceral and the virtual? The great American poet Gary Snyder, way back in 1969, in fact, the text of an essay, Four Changes, was running through the Whole Earth Catalog, which I showed you earlier. And he had this wonderful line where he envisions a future of computer programmers walking with the elk. So in many respects, to me, that's a very interesting notion. And that is, how do we balance the visceral and the virtual, which has been a theme in all of my work. I write about it at some length in Bringing the Biosphere Home. And I write about it in this book as well, because the challenge has gotten that much more extraordinary. So I'm going to move on now. Again, each of these chapters and each of the sections in the chapter are worlds unto themselves, portals, if you will, to our intellects and exploring all the interesting ideas that this age demands of us. But I want to focus now on this one. This chapter is called Constructive Connectivity. And I'm going to talk for a little bit about social and ecological networks. This is a photo. Think for a minute if any of you have any idea of what this photo might be. And while I talk, you can figure that out or not. This is a photograph of the so-called Golden Spike. The Golden Spike was the final railroad tie that that made the Transcontinental Railroad a reality, that connected East and West. So if you think about in the States, and by the way, the same kind of thing is true in any country. If you look at the UK, when is there finally a connected network that brings goods and ideas and materials back and forth? This was the one that allowed for the transcontinental flow of goods. By the way, in the latest London Review of Books, there's an incredible essay by, I'm forgetting the author's name, about a book that I never would have thought about reading because it's about shipping in the Arabian Peninsula, of all things. But the essay starts out, this is relevant for what I'm going to say, it starts out by talking about what happened when that ship clogged up the Suez Canal. And it goes on from there to talk about what he calls global gargantuism. So I would check it out. It's an amazing essay that talks about the proliferation of consumer goods moving back and forth, the cheap energy that allows it to happen, and the kind of connectivity that's necessary for it. And you could probably find, read one essay for free online if you check it out, the London Review of Books. John Lanchester, I think that's the author's name, John Lanchester. At any rate, this is the Transcontinental Railroad does many things. It allows goods to move back and forth very quickly, as does the Suez Canal, as does the Panama Canal. But conceptually, it breeds the notion of connectivity, and it breeds the notion of the internet, ultimately, well, 100 years later. By the way, the Transcontinental Railroad, and this is a bit of a digression, the Transcontinental Railroad was filled with fraud, filled with debt that never got really paid back, used immigrant labor, and rammed its way through many indigenous lands. This was not a pretty construction project, but nevertheless, there it was. Getting to the main point at hand now, what I'm advocating for is that there is a course that we teach more about ecological and social networks in environmental studies. We start with ecological networks. On the bottom left is a portrait of the Earth from space that depicts dendritic drainage, a term in geomorphology. On the upper right, we see tree roots. And on the bottom right, we see mycelium, which the great mushroom visionary, Paul Stamets, describes as the original internet. There's some amazing work about mycelium. In fact, Merlin Sheldrake, his wonderful book, Entangled Life. Robert McFarlane gets into it in Underland. David George Haskell gets into it in his book on forests. We know very little about the world of mycelium, but what we do know is that it's the connective tissue of the entire forest. If there's a very elaborate communication system that's taking place. And why would we know much about it? When you think about the number of scientists, mycelial scientists, compared to, let's say, the numbers of lawyers and economists and bankers, you can't even scale the relationship. There are so few people studying this. There are so few people studying soil science. Yet, this is crucial to our survival on the planet. The more we can understand and model what happens through mycelium, through these networks, the better we're going to understand the biosphere and our ability to adapt to the very rapid changes that are coming. And if you look around the planet, you see these incredible networks of migration. These are the migratory routes of numerous seabirds in the Pacific Ocean. You see, there are wonderful diagrams. It's a very interesting and proliferating new dimension of ecological research, and that is ecological network research. And so these are, again, very stylized diagrams of prey-predator relationships, food chains within some of these complex and very robust and intricate networks. Look at the diagram on the right and just take a mental picture of it. I'm going to get back to a similar type of diagram two more points during this presentation. And now we look at social networks. And social networks are so crucial to our survival in this day and age. I've got grandkids, thankfully, I'm finally going to see after 15 months, now that we're fully vaccinated, who already are involved in social networks. But no one really teaches them how to do it. You learn on your own, but there are things you need to learn. For example, we know that most people engage in what are called homological networks. And by that, we mean similar networks, that you hang out with people who are like you. And so that's the so-called bubble, that we hear about all the time. But we also know that creative individuals and creative organizations have lots of people that are nodes in networks. That is, people who can connect to networks. And there are people like that. You might know them. You may be one of them. Let's say in high school or in schooling, you never felt like you were part of any particular group. You were always a part of several, though. Well, it turns out that might have been a really good thing, because you can walk between lots of different worlds and develop credibility. So the question then becomes, how do you teach people to become nodes in networks? How do you teach them how to break out of homological networks? How do you teach them how easily networks are manipulated for various types of purposes, often authoritarian or often commercial? So this also needs to be part of the training. And I think there's a long way to go, and there's a lot of learning that we can support and initiate related to ecological and social networks. One of the things that I do when I consult viscerally, which hasn't happened in a while, is I ask folks in an organization to construct network maps. So you can do this at Schumacher College. You can do it with a group of people. Well, where are our individual networks? Where are our organizational networks? What ground do we cover? What ground don't we cover that we should cover? Are there ways that we can strategize around our own future, around our own teaching and learning based on what we've learned about our networks? So there's a lot that can be done. And of course, All of this is covered in the book. Everything that I'm talking to you about is covered in great detail. And at the risk of sounding presumptuous or egotistical, the book is very clearly, and I think engagingly written with a lot of personal experiences. Yes, there are some tough places. You know, there's a lot of ideas to cover, but the book is a reader's book. One of the things I love to do when I'm working on a presentation is to use Google Images. And if you put the word social networks in Google Images, this is one of the things you get. So there are a lot of people thinking about this, and a lot of theorists who are trying to make sense of it. We are in the earliest days of trying to figure out what these things mean. If you're interested in diagrams like this, there's a great book by Manuel Lima called Visual Complexity, which gets into mapping patterns of information. I refer to this also in the annotated bibliography in my own book. This leads us, and by the way, I'm about 60% done, 2/3 done. You know, if it's too much, it's a bit of a gauge for you as to where I'm at, and then we can open it up to questions. I focus a lot on migration. I think there's a direct relationship between networks and migration, of course, because I think this is the seminal challenge of our time and for the next several decades. It is the seminal issue of the 21st century. Because if you think about the planetary emergency results in various types of ecological and climatological catastrophes that force people to move, both within a country or from one country to another. Now, clearly there are political challenges and catastrophes that create this as well. But migration is increasing in its severity and its importance. And at the same time, we see these walls being built, and there's a disconnect here. A person who's forced to migrate could be anybody. These are middle-class people who have to leave their homes for one reason or another. It could really happen to anyone. In the States, I think about the wildfires that swept through California, or the hurricanes that swept through Houston and New Orleans, and of course, New York City. And when people are dispossessed, they have to leave. The pandemic was another really interesting reverse example where the wealthy said, I'm getting out of the city, and we're buying up land in places where I live because they wanted to escape. But the idea is that there's a lot of displacement that goes on, and it's important that we understand this and work on it. And there's a lot to unpack here. Look at these world migrations since 1500. The flow of people, by the way, from Europe to North America and from Africa to North America, typically forced. And in Europe, often it was for opportunity. When we hear about all the restrictions on immigrants, people conveniently forget how this country was colonized by immigrants. But nevertheless, these movements of peoples are ubiquitous in human history. They've always been there. And in fact, humans are their own. It didn't take us very long, when we left Africa as a small tribe, to settle the entire world. It really didn't take us very long at all from geological perspective. Yet, look at all these walls that are built around the world. The wall that's apparently is going to start to get dismantled, that was tried to separate North and South America, North America and Central America. The walls in South America, the walls in Europe, the walls in Africa, the walls in Asia. There are walls everywhere. And yet there's no more unecological concept than a wall that separates ecosystems and landscapes. It just doesn't fit, it doesn't work. Some tangible examples. On the upper left, we see the wall on the Mexican-US border. On the upper right, it's barbed wire keeping people out of Hungary. On the bottom right, it's Kuwait and Iraq. On the bottom left is, of course, the most iconic wall of all, which is the Great Wall of China. So we've been building walls to keep barbarians out as long as humans have been so-called civilized. And it's not only people between countries, but it's people within countries that are often displaced. What we see in a lot of American cities, especially in the booming cities, is a process of gentrification, where long-standing traditional communities are often displaced because of real estate values. This is a huge issue in the States, and I think everywhere in the world. Again, there's so much to cover here. And here's the second example. Remember, I told you to hold a picture in your mind of the diagram. Well, this is the second example, and it's going to culminate in a third one at the very end of the slideshow. This is a stylized diagram of human movements between mid-2005 and mid-2010. And you can see, just very quickly, you can grasp metaphorically the incredible numbers of people who go from one place to another. You can study this for quite some time and learn a great deal. The references for all of these things, by the way, are available, and I can get them to you if you're so interested. But the point I want to make above that, the layer here, if you will, there are multiple layers, but the next layer is the biosphere is filled with migratory processes. The continents themselves migrate. So here is the unfolding of Gondwana land from 250 million years ago to the present. And if we wait around long enough, it will all come back together again. So continents are always moving. And as continents move, critters need, flora and fauna have to move because they need new habitats. Here's a stylized picture. This is actually from a video of vernal movement, of spring movement in the States. This is what's going on right now. Mammals, birds, and amphibians are crisscrossing the country, moving from south to north, mostly, and then they move back from north to south. All of this, by the way, is being challenged by various habitat changes and by climate. But this is very dynamic. It's very beautiful. It's endlessly fascinating to me. We're in the middle right now of spring migration. Every day there's a new bird coming through. Every day there's a new insect arriving. Some insects migrate. So it's bats, of course, migrate. Look at the map on the left, and that's the eastern United States. And this shows you the movement of, it's a biogeographical map that shows you the movement of various plant species that are projected over a 100-year period of time. So we see a very extraordinary movement. Now, of course, these movements have always happened because you can go back another X number of 10 years and you have glaciers, you have ice covering all of this. And with the retreat of the ice, you have the movement forward, you have the movement of various flora and fauna. But this is projected to take place over a 100-year period of time. And pretty astounding. So I've made my point. I'm not going to belabor this any further. I do feel that migration is a biosphere process. It's natural, it's intrinsic to the human condition. That doesn't mean to say that there should be no limits on the ability of people to move from one place to another, but we need an ecological and a cultural perspective on migration, not just a political and economic perspective. And that, I think, is the bottom line. And that's where the teaching and learning has to focus. It's very easy for demagogues to look at political and economic migration and use it as a way to create a false sense of nationalism. I'll quote Gary Snyder again, who described nationalism as the grinning ghost of lost communities. And what he meant to say by that is you create fervor around a subject and you really can't necessarily do it unless there's already been something lost in a community. So what are the ecological and cultural challenges that we face thinking about migration? How can we be better equipped to do this? I spend a great deal of time on this in the book, and I won't go over this diagram right now. There's so many great resources if you're interested in this. I love Sonia Shah's book, The Next Great Migration. Very readable, covers a lot of ground. The African-American migration from south to north after the Civil War is covered brilliantly by Isabel Wilkerson in her great book, The War of Mother Sons. Even the staid National Geographic, although not so staid these days, did an entire issue on migration. And there are many UN agencies where there are all kinds of things that you can download if you're interested in the subject. And I will suggest to you that understanding connectivity and understanding networks and understanding migration is, in fact, the future of environmental studies and the future of environmental learning. That folks who understand how to deal with these questions will be able to do some very powerful and important work in the years to come. Educational institutions that move forward on them will be training the people that we need to move forward into the future. Because as environmental change proliferates and as it becomes more rapid, these are the circumstances of our times. These are the circumstances of our lives, and we need to prepare to be dealing with them. I spent a lot of time in the book looking at cosmopolitan culture, and I relate it back to the issue of place and bioregionalism and some of the classic ideas from the 70s and 80s that are still very important to me and that I've written about before. But what I try to show in this chapter is how ecological urbanism, which is a whole new category of teaching and learning, is very much a bioregional project. There are amazing projects happening all over the world. And here's another thing I want to say at this point, and I'll conclude with this later on. One of the things that's happened, at least in the States, and I think pretty much everywhere in the Western world, or in any world that any of the so-called advanced electronic communications nations, is how rapidly news gets monopolized. And one of the things that we've seen in the States, I don't care what the media outlet is, left or right, is all we hear is about polarization. And all we hear is about this great divide. But I claim from my own personal experience, as limited as that is, that if you really talk with most people, not everyone, but most people, you can break through. You really can break through. And you have to listen well, and you have to understand well. And I have seen tons of projects across North America and around the world where you have folks that are multi-generational, multicultural, different political perspectives who are making change in their communities. You can go to almost any city in the country and throw a rock and find a really interesting project. So I did a project called Pacific Northwest Changemakers, where I profiled a whole bunch of really interesting projects in the Pacific Northwest, sustainability projects that were non-campus, multicultural, multi-generational, and I picked 8. I could have picked hundreds. You can download that for free at my website, Pacific Northwest Changemakers. But what I love, we have an obligation, all of us, to highlight the voices of the change makers who are making a difference in the world, because the global media apparatus doesn't do it. It just doesn't do it. They're interested in other things. So we have to make it part of our responsibility to empower, to inspire, to call attention to the really good things that are happening, because honestly, if we don't do that, who will? Just a quick little note that North America, prior to European colonization, was quite cosmopolitan and quite culturally diverse and biodiverse. These are some of the language groups in North America. By the way, you could do the same thing in England. I'm going to talk about McFarlane's great work, Landmarks. Is that the name of it? In a moment. Yes, Landmarks. So hold off on that thought for a second. And I think we're ready for a kind of cosmopolitan bioregionalism. I wrote an essay of that title many, many years ago. But what I mean by that is local places think a lot about what's important in their place, locally, culturally, ecologically, politically, but never forget the relationship between their place and other places. And if you look at some of the really outstanding projects, both in rural and urban, I'm speaking about America, they all embody, or they wouldn't use this language, but they embody this spirit. And there's a spirit of what I would call cosmopolitan bioregionalism that really matters. I'm going to skip on all of this now in the interest of time. The last 2 chapters in the book are really of one, and one excellence. And I feel that to move forward into the next era, and we're really currently in it, we need to teach more about improvisation, because improvisation is a form of adaptation. And one of the things that we know is that with environmental change, there's so many dynamic variables taking place. So the question is, how do we teach and learn to adapt to those variables in ways that are constructive? So in this chapter, what I try to do is I try to highlight works that bring that to bear. And they come from all different kinds of perspectives. I love David Rothenberg's book, 1,000-Mile Song, which is, by the way, featured in National Geographic this month. He's written a whole bunch of really beautiful books about improvising with various critters. He's got a book on insects, a book on birds, a book on whales. I love Robert McFarlane's book, Landmarks. And by the way, this tells us a lot about what the importance of place-based Indigenous learning. What McFarlane does in this book, if you're not familiar with it, is he's aghast that a recent edition of the Children's Dictionary has replaced natural history words with tech words. So he goes on a mission to find as many words describing natural history landmarks, if you will, or landforms, water forms, as he can through many of the indigenous languages of the British Isles. And he asks people to contribute to this. So what he's developed, so anyone who's reading, who's in the UK right now, go out and get this book if you don't already have it. What he's done here is he's put together this incredible glossary of fantastic words that describe processes in the natural world for which there isn't a word necessarily, except for in this ancient language. And I found just by going through the book and reading these words, I thought, oh, wow, this is opening me up to seeing processes that I'd never quite thought of before. And what David Lucas, a good friend of mine who lives in the Cascades in Washington, did in his book, Language Making Nature, is he suggests that you make up your own words. When you perceive something that you've never quite perceived before. So one of the things I do in this chapter is on a beautiful autumn day, I reflect on a whole bunch of patterns that I'm seeing and what words might correspond to those patterns. So this is really important and very interesting and exciting educational activity that lots of different organizations can do. So I talk a lot about improvisation. Improvisation has been a big theme in my life. The things that I've always loved to do, playing music, I play keyboards and guitar, playing games, board games, playing sports, playing basketball. One of the people here today is an old basketball buddy of mine. The bonds you create, the learning that happens, that takes place, observing nature. This whole chapter is a testimony to different ways of teaching and thinking and learning about improvisation so we can direct it towards being better practitioners related to environmental change. So part of how we do this is we enhance our ability to perceive patterns in nature and when they emerge and what they mean and why. There's so much there. And of course, there is a great book, one of the classic books of world literature, the I Ching, the Book of Changes, that is in fact an improvisational knowledge system based on biosphere archetypes. So I have a section in this chapter as well that looks at that as the potential and its potential for improvisational learning. And finally, the book concludes, but I'm gonna have one last thing to say after this concluding chapter, because I want to go back to the memory chapter, with a chapter called Perceptual Reciprocity. And what I mean by that is I think that ultimately to engage and perceive the biosphere, we have to come to the recognition that every critter and every landscape on this planet perceives. That doesn't mean that it's sentient, but there's some level of a perceptual reality that takes place in any environment that we're in. And our challenge as learners is how do we tap into that? And what are the best ways of doing it? It's our last chance really in many respects to know what it means to be human, is to tap into the perceptual reciprocity of the planet. What can we learn from other creatures? What can we learn from other landscapes? And on the human level, what can we learn from other cultures? I don't think there are any more important questions than that to open minds at every age level, K through gray. Here's the diagram a third time, I guess the one on the right. I don't know if you've seen this before, but there's a UK researcher named Ricard Harris who studies psilocybin. Now, I'm not advocating the use of psilocybin. Let me make that one clear. But what I find fascinating about this is on the left is a diagram of the brain under normal circumstances related to the various synapses that are connecting, roughly speaking. And on the right, we have that same brain under psilocybin. So what winds up happening is that there's a broadening of an expandedness of experience, a mind-blowing, if you will, that's really quite incredible. Now, for environmental learning, I think there are things that you can do that put people in flow experiences that are not drug related, that enable them to open more synapses. And that's another important goal of learning, is how do we do that? And there are many traditions for it. There are mindfulness meditation traditions. There are, and many, many others. Some people do it through extraordinary outdoor experiences and hiking and swimming and whatever it might be. But that is part of the learning challenge, is opening ourselves up to the vastness of experience, the relationship between absence and presence, using the old Taoist terms. And that's what I mean by perceptual reciprocity. And finally, the culmination of perceptual reciprocity is how we reside in our ecological neighborhood. And these are some photos that I took from the Pacific Northwest Changemakers Project. In the upper left is Garden City Harvest, which is a wonderful gardening program that deals with elder care and social relationships and foster questions in Missoula, Montana. On the bottom right is the Centerpole Project, which is the Crow Reservation, the Crow Nation in Montana, which does a lot with indigenous learning and food banks. And on the bottom left is a ecological restoration project in Portland, Oregon, that has anti-gentrification programs and ecological entrepreneurship programs. So really the final message I want to send before a very brief note on memory, the final message that I want to send is, what is your ecological neighborhood and how do you define it and how do you participate in it? And ultimately, how do you contribute to it? Because none of this means anything if it doesn't culminate with acts of service within your ecological neighborhood. That's what we're all striving for. That's the purpose of all of this work. A few final notes. I'm very interested, maybe because I'm 71, but I'm really interested in the role of memory in general and how we assess our lives in relationship to learning. And I think that there's a balance between adaptive learning, which is finding a path through the changing flows and circumstances of all of our social and technological encounters, and also perennial learning, which is awareness of the wisdom of the ages. So I have a wonderful, I use a program called Headspace to help me meditate, and it's on the internet. You know, it seems so strange in a way that I'm using a program on the internet to help me with a daily meditation practice, but I do. And there's nothing wrong with that in my view. And so to me, that's an interesting blend of adaptive learning and perennial learning. And this is part of what we're called on to do. And as part of thinking about memory, we also need to think about posterity, as well as ancestry and legacy. So I love Gary Snyder's comment about thinking about this present moment that lives on to become long ago. So part of how we think about memory is going back and reviewing your own childhood experiences, which I do early on in the book. I loved the book Harold and the Purple Crayon when I was 4 or 5 years old. I was reading at a very early age. I was just immersed by the magic of this book. Harold falls asleep and he starts dreaming and he starts drawing his own adventures. And then he gets really, he's expanding. It's like this whole notion of bringing the biosphere home, going out in space and time. And then he gets worried and he doesn't know where he is. And he gets into danger and he draws his way out of danger. And that to me is the epitome of improvisational excellence. And he can't find his house. So he draws all these windows and then he remembers, oh yes, of course, there was a half moon window behind my window. So he drew the half moon and then he drew the window and then he drew his bed and he found his way home. To me, that's just a beautiful notion of place-based learning and improvisational learning. When I was just a very young boy, my parents took me to the Hayden Planetarium in New York City, and it really did blow my mind. It was extraordinary. So I brought home The Golden Guide to the Stars, and I just lived in that book. And it was both wonderful and terrible. To think about questions of scale on this notion. Maria Montessori says kids as young as 3 can think about infinity. And anyway, it opened me up to the world of natural history and the world of wonder. And I think we have to think very carefully about how do we re-engage with those aspects of who we are and a very beautiful aspect of the human condition itself. And then there's the dark side of memory. When I was a little boy, I lived in a suburb of New York City in what had been a swamp. And this must have been 1954, 1955, 56. And the fogman would come through. And this fogman would spray DDT. And at the time, I thought, whoa, clouds. I love clouds. I was interested in the weather. I can run through a cloud now. But after I did it once or twice, I started to get headaches. And you know, I've had cancerous tumors removed from my body, curable, thank goodness, twice in my life. And I often ask, was this it? Was this what caused it? Now, there's no way of knowing, but there are some very dark, I mean, another dark memory from that era was when I was 6 years old, in first grade, we'd have air raid drills because of the Cold War, and the teachers would ask us to put our heads down on the desk. And even as a 6-year-old, I knew that that was the stupidest thing I ever heard of. You're asking me to put my head down on a desk when I've seen pictures of an A-bomb? Are you kidding me? So these things at a very early age told me that, you know what, I may not be able to trust adults. I may not be able to trust teachers. So I think it's important as part of teaching and learning that we use memory not only to bring out the wonderful experiences of childhood, but also to bring out the toxic and terrifying experiences as well, because we balance those in our everyday lives right now, all the time. So it's very important to call attention to those. Now, what I do in the book, and I think this is the last slide or next to last slide, is I have a whole bunch of different activities, and you can briefly scan through these that essentially ask the reader, either on his or her own, or through some kind of educational setting, to do the kind of work that I'm doing in the book, because I think the most important thing is that you figure out your relationship to this material, that you write your own narrative. And anything I've ever done in education suggests that the role of a teacher is to empower students as learners so they can take control of the information and write their own stories in that regard. So that's enough for now. If you're interested in any of my work, please visit my website. It's just myname.com. Write to me. I always write back. I'm a very prompt email correspondent. As I've said before, I'm always happy to give talks for other organizations. I don't charge anything. I require no compensation for virtual talks. And I feel like I want to be utilized and want to serve. So get in touch with me if anything in here is something that you want to talk about or think more about. Okay, I need to get some tea.
Well, thanks so much, Mitch. That's really fantastic. I feel like we had a really deep dive into the book and into your own sort of neural network and thinking about relationships to place and relationships across place. And I really appreciate the sort of emphasis and focus on networks and movement, particularly as we're about to start up a new master's program on movement, mind, and ecology. I think it intersects really interestingly. I've got so many questions myself, but recognizing we're running a bit short on time, and there are lots of questions from our participants, I might just ask a couple of those if that's all right.
Absolutely. And I'm happy to stay as long as anyone else is.
I think we'll go a few more minutes, so about 10 past perhaps.
Don't forget to make sure you ask Fran's question down there at some point.
I will make sure I ask Fran's question, but also just note that there are a couple of requests for references. So some of the things that you mentioned, if there's a way, maybe on your website, or if you want to email them to me, I can share them with the participants. The name of your son, for example, if they'll look up some of his art, things like that. So any references would be really handy if you wouldn't mind.
I'm happy to do that. And also, I think the most direct way to do it is for folks to write to me. Go to the website, my email is there, write to me. I can give you anything you want directly. And that way I have a contact with you as well, which I think is great for both of us. So great. I'm happy to do it that way.
Excellent. I mean, there are a couple of early questions here, from Grace and from Tanya about sort of the electronic age, right? And thinking about digital social networks evolving. And I mean, you can see these questions yourself, but I wonder if we might think about sort of Grace's question: how do you see digital social networks evolving, and any examples of online social networks operating with sort of more ethical and non-commercial priorities? I think on top of that, think of Tanya's question about, how our behavior is changing as a result of these networks that we're sort of constantly plugged into, constantly engaging with, and resulting in some of the myopia that you were mentioning before. So, any thoughts there?
Well, any thoughts that I have are no better than anyone else's, honestly, because I'm exploring and using just as much as anyone else is, and I think, during COVID, we've been using this even more. So there have been some good aspects to that, but for the most part, I think it's too much. I'll put it that way, and I do think it brings a kind of myopia. Here's the way I look at it. I'm a little dizzy right now. And not in a serious way. Maybe lightheaded would be a better word. And it's not because I'm old or because I've been talking too fast. It's because I've been staring at the friggin' screen for an hour, even longer, an hour and a half. And I just don't think our bodies are capable of doing that. They shout out and they want something different. And yet there's a magnetic appeal to the screen
Mm.
that we have to resist at all times. So, you know, do you take breaks every 15 or 20 minutes? Do you go outside every 15 or 20 minutes?
Mm.
How do classrooms do this? Do organizations do this? How much better would people work in organizations if they spent less time in front of their screens? How much healthier and happier would we be? I'm just asking these questions. I'm not opposed to it. I'm not a Luddite. I couldn't have written my book without this.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I couldn't have had this talk with you all today without it. But as my mother used to say, enough is enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
and regarding social networks, you know, I think it sounds so silly in a way and hypocritical. I think you can research that on the internet. I mean, you really can. You can just direct and find out who's doing the kind of work that really makes sense in that regard. Look, I just started getting emails, like 3 or 4 a day, from Daily Kos, K-O-S. Who are they? I'm not even sure. I don't even know how it happened. But the last email they sent was they really need money because they're the only networking site that covers news issues that's not a part of monopoly media.
Mm.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. I must get 50 emails a day from some political entity asking me for money. It's not right.
Yeah.
It's not what politics is. It's not what we should be doing. So I don't remember if it was with Grace or Tanya or both of you, Tanya. My answer to you is look at your organization, look at your work life, look at your personal life, find ways that you can make changes that are productive for you. You're the pioneer. You're the ones who have to figure out how we do this the right way. We all need to be thinking about this together. One last point. When I used to do sustainability at Unity College, I used to say, hey, everyone needs to be sharing their experiences. They're not proprietary. I want to know what your college is doing. I want to know what Sterling College, which is where I was at the time, is doing, so we can do that at Unity. And I think the same is true with this stuff as well. How do we navigate social networks? How do we navigate electronic media? Let's write about it. Let's think about it. Let's share our experiences together. And let's do it in person when this darn pandemic is under control.
Yeah. Yeah, I take some solace, Mitch, in what you said at one point, that we're at the very beginning of some of these, social networks, or some of these broader sort of electronic networks that we're all part of. And I think this sort of face-to-face on the screen is really a very rudimentary way of communicating that, maybe we'll see evolve over the years.
Yes.
Yeah. So I take some solace in that this is not the final way that we're going to end up communicating in the world. So let's maybe move on to Fran's question. I think this one is custom made for you, actually, but how do you describe the value of improvisation within leadership?
Well, Fran and I used to play not only basketball, but softball together. And thanks, Fran, for that big, soft, fat pitch. When I was president of Unity College, a small environmental college in Maine, I was not prepared for it. I had never aspired to that kind of position. The only reason I got involved with administration was because I wanted to make life better for the people I was working with and life better for myself. And people liked me and trusted me, and they put me in those positions. And lo and behold, one day I found myself president of a college. And what I found when I was there was that every day something would happen that I'd never quite seen before. And I could say that almost about every single day of my experience. And the question will always be, well, how do I deal with this? So my theory of improvisation is this. It's whether you're playing music or playing basketball. If I'm playing basketball, I'm going to practice my shots. If I'm playing music, I'm going to do some practicing of scales or whatever it is I'm going to practice. And then when the time comes, when I'm with other people, or I'm playing a game, or I'm playing in a band, we're going to explore places that I've never been before, but I'm going to be equipped to do it because I've got the foundations down. Now in leadership, your foundations are your philosophy of learning, your philosophy of meaning, and your general sense of ethics and care. And those are things that need to be formulated before you're in a leadership position, because you always will wind up relying on those when you encounter things that you've never quite seen before. You'll be equipped to deal with them because you have a strong values foundation, you have a strong ethical foundation. So that's how I see it. And then you learn and then you grow. The next time something happens, well, I've seen that, I have more experience now, but it's going to be a little bit different. And so every case is slightly different. If you just resort to only what you know, you're going to make the wrong decision, right? So that's part of it, but that's a long conversation. And actually, you know, Fran Silvestri, who asked that question, understands this quite well and has been in many of these situations in his own life. But that may be for another seminar and another time.
Great, thank you. And maybe, so I think one last question here, and then you know, maybe it's actually a fairly long one, I think, but that Tim put on here. You know, given the interconnectivity you've highlighted between the social, economic, political, and ecological factors affecting our planet, do we need to make up a new holistic study or research subject field to advance our thinking? You know, do we not quite have the right sort of academic or field or framework to be able to do this work?
When I was on the road a lot, visiting various campuses and universities in many different capacities, sometimes I would review an environmental studies program. Sometimes I'd meet with the president and the senior staff about how they can move sustainability forward. I would always meet with the students too. And what I found, I'd always ask students, well, you know, what are you learning? What are you studying? What's your major? Why are you here? And so on. Almost every student who I found who was involved in sustainability and environmental studies didn't pay a lot of attention to whatever the standard major protocols were at their campus. So someone would say, well, you know, my major is biology, but you know, I'm minoring in I'm minoring in green literature, or you know, my major is environmental studies, but I'm minoring in neurobiology. They would figure it out on their own, where to go and how to get things done in the way that made the most sense. Now, the value of an institution setting up a structure is that there are some people who can't necessarily do that. And by setting up a structure, you say, this is what we value. The problem with most institutions, though, is that they become ossified and unbendable. And you can't move them because the faculty are so deeply committed to whatever they think are the requirements for entry into their discipline. So true educational leadership, by the way, Michael Crow has done this at a huge university, at Arizona State University. The true quality of educational leadership, and you will get this because you are, I think, also an exemplary interpretive synthesist. I think the point is you create things flexibly and you're willing to move and make changes as necessary that reflect student interest, student need, and the tenor of the times. When I was at Antioch, New England, we did that all the time, but I have to say, I would battle all the time with faculty. Faculty would say, well, students need this, and they need this, and they need this, and they need this. Say, no. You can't do that because it'll never work. It's not interesting and will never change. So I think there has to be a lot of flexibility on the part of faculty and educational leadership. And educational leadership has to be bold in saying, we will not survive. Our school will not survive unless we are bold and creative in how we, you know, develop these configurations. That's what they're let me put it this, they're ephemeral configurations. Yep. I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, I think that's a really great way to, I think, sum up a lot of what we've been talking about here. And you know, thanks for the perspective on the work that we've both been doing over the years. And I think, you know, getting into positions of leadership is really the way to help make some of that substantive change. So it's really an honor to be working in that space.
Yes,
so
that's great.
Yeah, so thank you once again, Mitch. This has really been fantastic. And I want to point out in the chat, folks have been pointing to, we have a talk tomorrow that you actually might be interested in on Goethe's morphology, sort of exploring and generating complexity online through Schumacher College as well. I think there was a link posted in the chat about that one. But just to share, again, thanks for all of our participants for joining us this evening. I know we ran a little bit late, so I know it's a little bit later for those of you in Europe on the mainland. So really appreciate you sticking out with us. And I hope that everybody's felt as inspired by the talk as I have. And I think Mitch showed his website address, fairly easy to Google. His email address is on there to contact him. And certainly take a look at our website, dartington.org, to learn more about all of our other offerings. We've got lots of interesting master's programs, short courses, other Earth Talks coming up. And again, we'd love to hear your feedback, how we can continue to improve these talks, and what sort of issues, topics, or speakers you want to see in the future. So please do keep in touch and keep sharing your thoughts. And again, thanks so much, Mitch. And
my pleasure. I'm really honored to do this, and I had a lot of fun. And I'm actually copying all the chat right now so I can see who is here, and all of that. So, and again, folks, write to me. I love hearing from people.
all right.
Or as they used to say where I come from, don't be a stranger.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Mitch, and good night, everybody.
Good night.